Uh, we discussed the state of the world and the current situation, at the end of the Second World War or at the time of independence in India. And in the end, we were. I think this is where I ended, right? Thus, we come to the crucial problem confronting nations just arising from underdevelopment or so-called underdevelopment, actually. In order to get on the road towards modernization, is it necessary to jettison the cultural past, which has been the raison d'etre of a nation? So that is an important question that everybody was asking, and in fact, uh, we'll dwell on this a little bit because what is the relationship between the past and the current situation of any country or any civilization? Do you let go of it completely? Do you continue with that? And if you continue with that, what is the what kind of complications arise because of that? And I think most nations fought with that, actually, and most nations fought with what they felt was their destiny and what they uh, imagined their past or or their history to be, and how the continuity between the past and the present and the future is imagined, actually. All nations, I mean, India is going through a very different phase right now, where we are rewriting our past in a certain with a certain point of view, when earlier the history was written with a certain point of view, and there are conflicting interests in both of those writings, which are clear sometimes, sometimes not clear, sometimes it becomes um, a mix of things. So it's always something, it's always a flux, right? And at the end of the, so at the beginning of the period of colonization, what we were discussing last year, when the Western nations advanced to a certain level and they felt that they had to go around the world, start colonizing these lands where they felt that the backward people or the people who were not civilized were living, and their development was on the backs of these nations, actually. But the way they rationalized it, all these Western nations, how they rationalized their methods of colonization and their sort of all the things that they did, which in even at that time, certain people in those countries felt that they were wrong, but they did them anyway. And the rationalization um, was that it was the white man's burden to go forth and to civilize the world, to civilize those who were living in darkness, who were living who in ignorance, barbarism, superstition, all those things. And there's this, um, and it's very revived now, but there was once a very famous poem by Rudyard Kipling called "The White Man's Burden." I won't. I mean, yeah. So, and this cartoon which came around that time in Britain was based on this, that it is actually the white man's burden to save the Chinese, the Indian, the Egyptian, the African, all of those people, to bring them to civilization. And civilization is this Western lady, goddess, who's sitting on top of a mountain. Actually, that is like um, the goal for all civilizations was to reach that point. And at the same time, um, there is this opposing movement of uh, telling everybody that that of the pitfalls of modernity. This anonymous French cartoon that they all fall down. Enlightenment and modernity combine in this depiction of the electric spark of liberty, overturning the thrones of the crowned heads of Europe and Pope. So what they were doing in this, liberating and civilizing backward people, would and that also means that equipping these nations with electricity, with railways, with all those modern, with factories, and with all the modern um, new things that were coming up in those nations through science and through reason and through rationality, those themselves will be the reasons for their fall. So they realize that the minute you educate those people who you thought were backward and bring them up to speed, bring them up to par with you, give them electricity, that will be the reason for your downfall also. So there was within that world also there was always a confusion of ends and means and reasons and causes and sort of uh, criticisms of current ways of thinking. So this is this criticism of capitalism, where capitalism and big business. So I mean, I hope you guys know this, that the East India Company um, was actually a capitalist business, was actually a capitalist enterprise, which first went out um, as a business actually, where people, normal day to day British English people bought shares in the East India Company, and they profited from the rule of the East India Company in India and all of the subcontinent actually. And it's only much later, when there was an uprising in 1857, the first rebellion and all of that, that the British government took over the company. Similarly, there were other companies actually, the French East India Company, the Portuguese company, all of those which actually went out into America also. So America was also colonized first, and the Native Americans were sort of subjugated and put into these ghettos, or what they call these kind of Indian nations, by capitalist business only. Australia, same thing happened. Lots of parts of Europe, same thing happened. China, they fought a war for the fact that they could supply what do you call uh, ganja, I mean marijuana actually. So those were called they fought with the Chinese government because they were not allowing them, the British, to supply marijuana to the Chinese actually. So it was always a capitalist enterprise, and then it became a state enterprise where uh, where imperialism became the business actually. But again, and then the same thing in reverse, if you see it, these factories in Edinburgh, these factories in Birmingham, Manchester, where pollution through these factories made it literally unimaginable for people to stay in those places actually. So modernization and industrial revolution, although it brought prosperity to these countries, it also brought a certain level of kind of demise in their social fabric and in their social structure in their lives actually. There was obviously improvement in certain other cases, and there was degradation of the environment and the atmosphere. And this is a picture of Manchester, where Frederick Engels, who along with Karl Marx wrote Das Kapital, in dry weather, a long string of the most disgusting blackish green slime pools are left standing on this bank, from the depths of which bubbles of miasmatic gas constantly arise and give forth a stench unendurable, even on the bridge 40 or 50 feet above the surface of the stream. This is at the end of the 19th century. The condition of these cities actually, and and what they were doing there was that they were transporting these environments to the other countries, which were now under their rule. This is a depiction of a factory in Germany during the industrial revolution. And people are now starting to explore through art, like they did before, um, the social working conditions of people, and not romanticizing it, but as satire, as social commentary. These start becoming very important, that the people who are benefiting from the enterprise of capitalism, from the enterprise of the industrial revolution, from all the growth that is happening on one hand, there is a depth darkness to that. There is another side of the coin which is also now being brought forth, and everybody is sort of getting aware of that. And simultaneously this advent of modernist architecture, And again, this cartoon in France is always amazing actually, in the way the French thought. They would so willingly criticize and poke fun at themselves. Actually, nobody else does enough of that actually. And so there are always these bulldozing of the traditional fabric of the city and creating these modernist solid blocks which are spread far apart, very tall modernist blocks of building. And this is just to compare, what happens, what we spoke about last time also, that the history of the world GDP, what it was before, what it was, in 1000 BC, 1000 AD, 1500, 1600, 1700. I don't know whether you can see my cursor, but see, up to 1820, it is China and India which literally have more than three-fourths of the total GDP of the world. Before, around the time around 2000 years back, it was slightly more in terms of the Indian nation. By 1000 AD, which was like the beginning or the throes of the dark ages in Europe, India and China share an equal amount of the world GDP, and it's literally 80% of the world GDP, 80 to 90%. And then you see how the share is going down, and then later on, after the 70s and 80s, in the 21st century, China and India are starting to again garner back a little bit of the share of GDP of the world actually. This is again, so I'm just trying to show multiple things at the same time. This is, I don't know if you guys know this, but this is Edward Munch in 1893. It is one of the most famous paintings of that time, and this is the Scream of Edward Munch. And the story behind it, Edward Munch was a Norwegian painter who came to Germany at a certain point and started practicing. He became famous also during his lifetime, actually. And this is something that he depicts as the horror of modernization, as the horror of life in a modern world. And he was on a walk one day, and this is something that he heard in the background actually. It literally is a scream that he thinks that he heard in the background. And this painting depicts the horror of that scream, and he equates it to the horror of living in the modern world actually, or what the world and urban areas and the cities and things were turning into. And this again, this shows what is happening at different times and different places, from England to France to Germany to Norway. All of that Western world is, there were people who were going out exploring, conquering and ruling, and becoming prosperous, and all of Western Europe was becoming much more and more prosperous through their colonization. At the same time, there were people who were feeling what was going on, and seeing into it, and understanding what kind of horrors they were creating. This is slide just before this painting actually, when the Eiffel Tower was being built in Paris. It was in the 1889 exposition, uh, which marked the 100th year of the French Revolution. So 1789 was the French Revolution, where they overthrew the French government, the French monarchy actually, and created these new rules for people, and the elites, or the royal families, and the bourgeois, and how they came together. And the French Revolution is, I think, a very famous and a very important landmark in the history of the world. And this competition was launched to to promote France as the industrial capital of the world, as the innovative capital of the world. By this time already it was clear that the British were controlling the world. The empire was already at its height. The British Empire was at its height in the 1880s and the 1890s. France was thrown out of India almost completely, except for maybe like Pondicherry and a couple of small other places. Portugal controlled Goa and parts around it. France in Pondicherry, this is in India, and the French were in Indonesia, or sort of the south, certain parts of Southeast Asia, maybe a little bit of Northern Europe was under French control, but they were thrown out of the two large sort of land masses in the world at that time. In that sense, the Indian subcontinent and from America actually. British control over, I mean, all controls, all European controls over Northern America was overthrown. It was only the Spanish who had a bigger stake in South America at that time. So the French still always felt that they were the center of the world. They were the heartbeat of the world. They were the cultural and the sort of um, the nerve center of the world actually. And France is always trying to do that, through its monuments, through its architecture, through its art and culture. It has always tried to compete and become the center of the world because France believes in that actually. That is their sort of, again, something that is at the core of their national value. And it was in a record time, 2 years, 2 months, and 5 days that the Eiffel Tower was built to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the French Revolution, and also there was an expo at that time actually. So all the other buildings that you see don't exist anymore. The Globe and that White Palace and stuff like that, they don't really exist anymore. This was at the time of the expo that all of this was built. And this is how the nations were depicted in the countries that they came into, where the steamroller is pushing the elephant. The elephant is India. The elephant is Indian community. It is Indian culture. And it obviously is Chinese culture and African culture. And the steam engine is the Western world. And the Western world is pushing the elephant back and trying to bring it to modernity. This is in 1908. And at the same time in Vienna, in Austria, there was this movement, which is a fantastic movement, and you should try and sort of learn about it. This building, it's an amazing building actually, by Joseph Maria Ulbricht in Vienna. This is called the Fin de Siècle. There is a word called Fin de Siècle, which is the turn of the century, which was again a very important period in continental European history, because it was philosophically, by that time continental Europe had lost to a large part of the world to England actually, and also they had lost interest in ruling some other parts of the world to some extent actually, not completely, but yeah, to some extent. And they were trying to break free from the colonialist mindset also, as well as from the old the Gothic and the Mannerist and Rococo and all these other systems of art. And this was the beginning of the Art Nouveau movement actually, which is this decorative but surface kind of movement of art, and which got transferred from sculpture and art to architecture also actually. So what they say in their kind of statement is that our art is not a combat of modern artists against those of the past, but the promotion of these arts against the peddlers who pose as artists, who have a commercial interest in not letting art bloom. The choice between commerce and art is the issue at stake in our secession. Secession means a separation. So they were separating from what were the kind of established dominant arts of that time, and which used these arts to get name to and fame to the people who professed or who practiced those arts, and undermined everybody else who was trying to do something new. It's not a debate over aesthetics, but a confrontation between two different spiritual states. And the secession movement, again, with um, other things that started primitivism and exploration of all these other worlds, and looking at them, Pablo Picasso looking at African art and primitive art and Indian art, and there were all these other uh, artists and architects and furniture makers who were looking at the rest of the world, and Japan became very popular at the same time through their garden systems and their gardening and um, mysticism. India around by 1910, India was again a ideas from India were coming into the West. Rabindranath Tagore was already starting to become famous. He just received the Nobel Prize. I mean, I will come to that also after that. So there is a very different movement in art which is going on at the same time, which is changing the nature of art as it was practiced, 15, 20 years back by that time. The in Russia, another movement of not deconstructivist but constructivism and suprematism, which took art in a very different direction also. So this is Kandinsky and his monument um, to the Third International, which is again a very different socialist monument uh, to a very different social structure. So there are movements in Europe also at the same time which are trying to break free from the imperial culture, the imperialist nature, from the kind of and talk about socialism, talk about equitable distribution of wealth, talk about people, talk about so many different things which were different than the colonialists, when they were really going out and conquering the rest of the world actually. So this was the modern movement, the beginning of the modernist movement and starting of the big shift actually, which uh, away from the old the old uh, traditions and old ways of doing things. New kind of graphic arts, new posters, which which were the Weimar Republic, the Bauhaus. These were all very egalitarian. They didn't depend only on the state. They didn't depend on patronage from the king. They were so many of these guys were people who came from the lower rungs of society, and through their art, through their philosophy, through their beliefs, started becoming more and more innovative and important in dissemination of a very different way of thinking of society, about society. These are all like, you know in the early 19th century, and how this one, it talks about man as a very different thing. Till now man was always thought of at this Vitruvian man, the center of the universe and the cosmos, and suddenly this idea of man changes. He's like a robot, and he's like a caricature. He's something that can be that is more mechanical now. The world is becoming mechanical. So science and the ideas of the city, the metropolis, which is a series of factories and people working as labor in these factories. These ideas start coming and becoming popular. This is an image of the first class of the first the prize winners from Madras University. At this time in, and I'm going back and forth actually. So uh, transposing different images and different times, just to help you understand that this is the way to look at history. Also, it's not linear in some sense. In and you go always, you see something at this time, and then you go back and you see something else, and that is where you find similarities and connections actually. This was the first school of art in India actually, the Madras School of Art, and one of the oldest art institutions in India, and it was established in 1850. This is the first prize winning batch of the government, and you can see the way, these are Indians who are still part of a certain tradition in India, but they are now graduate. They are now shifting. So their minds are shifting. Actually, their minds are starting to think like a Western person. The education that they are getting is like a Western person. The way, in India, artists were never taught in schools like this. There were no formal schools. There were only schools which sprang up through a guru or through a figurehead. Actually. So all the earlier schools of art that we talk about, or the schools of painting and schools of music, gharanas, They were formed as cliques, as sort of not formal cliques, but something that you belong to through your art and your way of doing things, through the person you follow. And suddenly now these were schools which were coming up in India, where anybody could get admission. And one second. You could be a part of a school and a new gharana suddenly through a teacher and learn a different thing, actually learn a new thing and become part of that. And this is again something that, you know, Ernst Havel, who was the principal of Calcutta, and then he came to JJ, also criticized quite a bit actually, that it was the modernization had this modernization had completely undermined the tradition of Indian architecture. The departmentalism of colonial modern state had introduced a system of building demoralizing, like to the architect and the craftsman, which had been so injurious to the true interests of the British Raj and fatal to the development of art and craft in India. So what happens is that the British at this time were starting to build buildings all over India, right? And they needed people, they needed draftsmen. They couldn't import every single architect and draftsman from England. So they started these schools. The first three schools, like I said, was Madras, Calcutta, and then Bombay. And they started developing these kind of artists who the draftsmen actually they were called, uh, who learned the British art of drafting, the Western art of drafting. But although they would come from traditional Mistri families, or you know, Sompura families, or architects families, or master masons families, actually, they learned the art the way the British practiced it. You know, so they would do drawings the way and we are all part of that system actually, which began then. You know, where we learn drafting in a separate environment in an office, and then it is being built somewhere else actually. I mean, I don't think in India, or maybe even in Europe, if you look at it, you know, maybe 400 500 years back, that the architect could be somewhere else and the building is somewhere else. The architect would always be a part of the site. He would always stay on the site as long as it takes. So you couldn't be an architect building 50 buildings all around the world at the same time. That was not the way architecture was practiced. You always were present on the building site. You were a part of the building team. So there was no, the architect earlier was always called the master mason actually, and he would be the one who would design and get the building executed. There was no separation, and the British system, obviously, in again all over Europe this happened, that system of the architect and the draftsman evolved, and the contractor and the building, you know, the execution happened somewhere else or by somebody else. And this is what they started teaching in Indian schools of architecture, because the British, obviously, after, you know, the government was formed and the Queen started ruling officially, they wanted to leave their imprint everywhere in India, and they wanted to build buildings actually. And all rulers want to do that. Anybody who comes to power wants to do that, and this is their way of doing it. So they started, you know, these schools where individuals are trained in the Western way, and they become part to this kind of this whole development of India at that time. And at the same time, you had these kind of Indian artists. Raja Ravi Verma suddenly went to the, he was a court painter in the Mysore court, and he, using Western modes of art but Indian themes and Indian stories, started painting, and sudden and over a period of time became extremely famous, became extremely a very big name in the art world. Went all over the country, painted for all sort of gharanas or all kings, and you know, he was being called from to Mysore to Baroda to Patiala to all these places where, and he opened his own, he was one of the first artists to open his own printing press for his own artwork actually. And then and you know, so so at one side the British are doing it. There are British people, architects, or you know, principals, teachers, who are bemoaning this rise of the Indian bureaucrat, the Indian draftsman, and saying that this is fatal to the development of art and craft in India. And at the same time, we have someone like Ravi Verma, someone like Abanindranath Tagore, who is using these modes and creating art which comes back to India. This is Mother India, right? And he is using this to undermine the British in some, or if not directly to undermine the British, to change the way we saw the Indians who were suddenly now being educated in British ways and who always thought that the British traditions were great. They start seeing India on their own terms. This is, say, then obviously, paintings of, the big merchants, the big kings, they started following the tradition of the British. Obviously there was a tradition of Indian courts for paper, getting, the royal painters to come and paint them, but the way and the style, if you see, before the British came, was very different. And this book is fantastic actually. If you get a chance to see B.N. Goswami, and he shows the way it changed the style of painting, for people. This guy with a book and a bookshelf behind him. No king ever made a painting of himself with a bookshelf. It was always swords, fighting things. It was a helmets and armor, and you know, a lion on his feet, things like that. And here there is somebody who's using books as a background and as a foreground to depict a very different personality. And so it's very interesting, the Tagore family actually. We already saw Abanindranath Tagore, who was uh, Rabindranath Tagore's uncle, and this is Gaganendranath Tagore, another member of the family, and he also painted very well. But he started also painting these caricatures actually. The the Indian who is now not an Indian, but he is a British kind of um, Indian in some sense, So he wears British clothes, he wears Western clothes, he dresses like that, he started eating like that, he's traveling all over the world. And this is a caricature of an Indian guy who wants to be a gentleman, right? And so there is again, I mean, what I want you to see is the conflict that exists in a society like this, and this conflict exists in today's time also. And we need people to bring that out, and there are artists who are doing that in today's time, and these are the conflicts that were happening in that time. The kind of, imagine the confusion of identities. You have the British who have conquered you, you hate them, but you still look up to them, you want to become like that, but your traditions are also there, and there are certain people who are looking at that and trying to improve those, trying to bring them back into your daily life. Then there are some who are saying that those traditions are bad and they were putting us down. There was always this conflict actually between people. So there were these kind of magazines which came out, which talked about Indian art, and which tried to look at Indian art. Uh, Obviously, these are Western points of views. There was no culture of publishing magazines in India before this. But this culture was always there. Pamphleteering and writing and sort of proselytizing was a Western phenomenon. But then obviously to counter the Western influences, this has to happen in Indian culture, and this happened all over the world also in different places. This is an article on the exhibition of Bauhaus in India in 1922, which was arranged following a suggestion of Rabindranath Tagore. And this, if you see that first drawing that I showed you, of those ladies wearing Rabindranath Tagore like dresses, that was 1921. And in 1922 he is instrumental in getting the Bauhaus to India. So that exchange. Now, the exhibition consisted of 19 drawings, 16 woodcuts by Lionel Feininger, Vasily Kandinsky, Paul Klee, Marx, George Mush, um, or Margaret Rayleigh, all these guys, their work is coming to India, and this was held in this house which was owned by the Tagores actually. And they also showed paintings by Indian artists such as Nandlal Bose, Abanindranath Tagore, Gaganendranath, along with the Bauhaus paintings actually. And okay. In the process, the Calcutta exhibition is presented as an exemplary case of the reorientation of a history of art that centers not on transmissions from west to east, but on encounters, affinities, and shared visions actually. So this is the important thing, that it is not one way. The transfer of knowledge, the transfer of influence is not from west to east only, but these are encounters, these are affinities, these are shared visions. It is an exchange. This is during that exhibition. This is a Bauhaus style school in Bangalore actually, where artists are taught how to paint in a certain style, in a certain way, on these very simple, using these very simple tools and furniture. This is Satyajit Ray, his cartoons and his uh, posters for his buildings actually, for his, not sorry, not his buildings, he's not, for his movies actually, and his books and stories. Ye Feluda, that very famous Feluda and Topshe, the first book in the first book that Satyajit Ray wrote actually. And at the same time, a little bit after that, we're going forward in time in some sense actually. Amrita Shergill, one of the foremost painters of India, uh, and she talks about this thing that modern art has led me to the comprehension and apprehension of Indian painting and sculpture. It seems paradoxical, but I know of certain that had we not come away to Europe, I should perhaps never have realized that a fresco from Ajanta or a small piece of sculpture in the Musée Guimet is worth more than the whole of Renaissance. Do you hear what she's saying? There is fresco from Magenta, and this is her point of view at that time actually. But she's talking of modern art and the kind of influences of modern art that is transferring all over the world, and that shows her that there are things that are in the past of different parts of the world which are as important, if not more, than what the Renaissance has led to actually in the Western world. And then yes, so same thing that happens in the West, Manchester, Birmingham, all those industrial cities, that poisoning is starting to happen in Indian cities also. In uh, in not just Indian cities, but cities all over the conquered, all over the imperial, the colonial centers actually. This is Union Carbide. I don't know if you know this word, Union Carbide. This was, I think, in 1934 or something. I don't remember. I don't think the date is written in this, but I do remember the date. Um, but Union Carbide, when it comes to India, to build a new India, and Union Carbide was responsible for the Bhopal gas tragedy. One of the biggest tragedies in India was because of this same company, that is Union Carbide. And they came to India saying that they want science to help build a new India. And this is now, I mean, we are nearing the end of today, but I just want to show you how society was changing at that time actually. This is 1937, and there's an exhibition for the ideal home in Times of India. This is not in the exhibition was in Bombay, but this was a drawing of the exhibition hall in the Times of India in 1937. And this is what the daily ads were in Times of India at that time. What, so they were, so this kind of modern living is starting to happen at the same time. So when science is trying to help build a new India, when we are changing through art and through culture, the rich lord who is sitting in his mansion, at the same time the art deco buildings in South Mumbai were being built. The rich Indians were starting to live in those houses and in those apartments, and this is what was being done for them. When Union Carbide comes, ACC comes, all these cement companies come, and they talk about these appliances, the hot water bath, the plumbing in the apartments, the geysers. These were things that were not available in India. And this was a gas geyser ad in 1934, where these kind of fancy English educated Indian couples, are going to come and live in these apartments. And this is what they want. This is what they are aspiring to. A gas geyser in your home will supply abundant hot water whenever you want it, at so small a cost that the price of the geyser is soon saved by the elimination of other water heating costs and the extra convenience, safety, and speed of heating. The Bombay Gas Company. For the milady of 1934, the finest of modern furniture for every pocket. Furniture ads, painting ads. So colors, flowers, so art, colors, life. So this is about art, and this is about painting and use of artistic shades of William Jackson company's paint. So painting your inside, painting the houses. I mean, at that time you would see that houses were painted in all these green, blue, pink colors actually. That you cannot imagine these houses. And that tradition of painting these pink, blue, green, yellow houses lasted well into the 1990s actually. I remember, I mean, if you were in Bombay apartments in 1980 or 85, from the balconies you would see all these colors of all these buildings, and people would use these paints colors in these apartment buildings. So the refrigerator, the first electric refrigerator when it came to India in 1936, to keep things cold, to keep things from going sour or bad, so from rotting actually. So safeguard your food, family's food supply. The women are shown doing all this. Designs for living, modern designs, the Army and Navy stores, which is there, all which is still existing in South Bombay. This is the time it came to India. And then we jump to slightly, we take a slight jump, and the beginning of Marg in just around the time of independence actually, when all, and Marg is again something that was started by a few people, by um, and more you know as a means of exploring Indian architecture as the mother art of everything, but also looking at holistically. So like Rupam, which I showed you before, which was very popular in the 20s and the 30s. Marg came later. It was primarily in English and catered more to a English reading population. And I mean, Marg is still there and it's beautiful actually if you see it now also. But the focus of Marg was architecture more than anything else actually. And the criteria that they used was the simple criteria of beauty, and it was beauty which which became part of society, which became important for society as a whole, and it became about lots of different things. So then this new ages are coming after independence, and this belief in a new world, new India, new building. I don't know if you've seen this. This is a very famous movie from 1957, which is about building a road to the railway station. Actually, I don't know whether it's to the railway station or not, but the villagers come together to build this road by themselves. And so it talks about how people come together and they unite and then they control their own destiny. This is obviously the Art Deco buildings which are being built at the same time at Nariman Point. And this is funnily Le Corbusier at the same time talking about India. And he says that the Indians, and this is something that he's talking about before he has even come to India, before he has even uh, I mean, before Nehru even thought of building Chandigarh and calling him to India. And Le Corbusier has no idea that in the future he will come to India and build something for us, for in India. And it's at that time he talks about the fact that Indians have passed without harm through the black days of day, and it's just a little bit condescending and not very nice, as a Western man to talk about it like that. But still, I mean, he's. I mean, it's important to how it was being seen, how India and modernity arriving in India was being seen actually by these people. So so he's talking about a tomorrow that can be radiant, and then he becomes an important part of that tomorrow actually by building Chandigarh and building things. So um, he talks about the fundamental truths and the roots of India that run deep in time. No unsaleable stocks of ill-considered equipment are to be found here. The human settlements, which are to the west a malediction, tentacular cities and crumbling considered countryside. India entering once more upon an active phase commences to equip itself. So this is India equipping itself. The Art Deco buildings, making its roads by itself. Mark, the new magazine which talks about the future of India and the past of India, the kind of furniture and all of that is happening around us actually. And that is a very famous scene of a Raj Kapoor movie. Raj Kapoor and Nargis going into the sunset, and that's the end of the dark era, and then you're moving into the new period actually. So that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Nilesh. So, I mean, just before we, break out for the discussion, there's just
Hmm.
one thing. I mean, when we were talking about different references, na. So,
Ah.
there was this book. I'm not sure. It's by Pawan Verma, Become an Indian.
Yeah.
It also
Yeah.
talks
Yeah.
about these whole societal conflicts of the whole
Yes.
identity issues and what and it is little bit I mean it is I think written recently. I think maybe 5 6 years back.
Pavan Verma was an Indian IAS officer
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
who retired, and then he wrote these 3 4 books actually. One of
yeah.
his the first book that he wrote was fantastic. I mean, and he writes in very simple language
Yes,
actually. So I
that's
think
the fun.
it is very good to read Pavan Verma. I think
Yes.
he's written lots of stories also, but I mean, yeah, I think that the kind of books that he writes now, what you're saying is this conflict
Yeah.
between, all these different issues is fantastic. Actually, it gives a very nice and a unique point of view about what you're saying.
Yeah, because you know what all kind of events or happenings that you were
Hmm.
stating through the whole presentation, and so it was basically all these different layers and of societal conflicts that were happening, which was actually
Hmm.
because of different perceptions that people at every level people were looking of the modern for the modern. Like I
Okay.
think I want to refer back. I mean, this is just a question. I'm also not sure, or just a comment, wherein you
Ah.
were talking about
Hmm.
the painting, okay, of the king,
Okay. Okay.
okay, wherein the painting was with books and books and the bookshelf and everything. So was it also kind of to signify a revolution which is like a intellectual modernism as an intellectual revolution rather than because as I said that people are perceiving modernism through different layers, like through lifestyle, like
Right.
what you're talking about, that gas geyser ad and the way
Hmm.
things were
Hmm.
depicted and written, or the refrigerator.
Hmm.
So and
Hmm.
even in that painting the most conflicting again thing was that the clothes that the king was wearing were very traditional clothes, okay. So
Yes.
the caricature that one shows wherein the Indian wannabe gentleman, and all the kind of so that was that was a very I mean these were some of the thoughts that actually I had. So I felt that it was more for like I think the Tagore movement that I could say, wherein he started doing paintings, getting different exhibitions
Correct.
here. It was
Hmm.
actually making people see modernism through our eyes rather than through the imperialist British kind of. So I think I think um, it was a very what you say volatile situation with respect to the intellectuals in India. I feel
Correct.
that time. I don't know. These are just
No,
I.
no. I think it's right what you're saying. That I mean, I didn't touch upon that because otherwise it would go too far. But at the same time, in writing poetry, the novel was introduced at the for the first time in India. We don't have a tradition of writing novels actually. So this Bengali, what they call, there is a word actually. I forget the Bengali intellectuals. There is a Bengali word actually, um, and there was a big rise in the Bengali intellectual. The intellectual renaissance in Bengal was primary in bringing the modern movement in India. Both, in writing, poetry, art, and films later on, and it's everything actually. So they were the first ones to take Western tropes or Western sort of, you know. Things and convert them into Indian.
Correct.
So the stories that we read now from Bengal from those times, they were actually the first times any Indian was writing a detective story. I mean, one of the reasons why I spoke about Satyajit Ray was also he was a science buff, and his Apu trilogy is all about as much about science as much about Indian life. So he is also saying how modern science, reason, rationality is getting embedded into an Indian way of living. So it was not incongruous for somebody wearing dhoti and a topi to be a scientist. You would
Correct.
always imagine the scientist to be, wearing Western wear actually, but that was not true. So that I think is very important, and that the Bengali Renaissance brought back a sense of nation and culture, along with accepting the good things from the Western world. The science, uh, the intellectual changes and movements, because that is what led them to believe strongly in their Indianness, and then repel the British actually in some
Yeah.
sense. So it is a part of that. I mean, but you're right actually. You're right about that. That it was, there were some people. So the bad things were happening, but there was a renaissance in thinking through education, through the Western inputs, which the Bengali intellectuals took and turned it around, and which is what, that earlier cartoon about the electricity, they all fall down,
Yeah.
was depicting also actually that the British brought it to us, and that led to their downfall actually
Done.
in some sense.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean it's very important for us to understand because now you have ended with Mark, and from next I
I
feel
know.
we'll totally go to the architectural realm. So it's very important for us to
Yeah.
understand and just look through these references to get an idea of what was happening during that time. So
And
I
next two
mean,
classes, we are going to be roaming around the world actually.
yeah, yeah.
And
So
then we will go to back to India actually. So it's going to be like a, yeah, tour in that sense. Okay,
yeah,
these guys, Akshita,
yeah.
Shriyansh, he, Rutuja, Sanyukta, can you guys, any questions? Turn your videos on here.
Hi, Shreyansh.
Right.
Sorry, I can't turn my video onto the Nimish. I have a very bad internet. I'm in college. So,
That's fine. That's fine. That's fine.
hi, Akshay.
Right.
Hi, Veer. Yeah, so what
Golo,
are your
questions,
thoughts? What are your
discussions?
thoughts, comments, questions, or doubts, or anyone else can also. But we, we really hope you guys kind of kick off the discussion.
I wanted to add to what Nimish said in the presentation about these artworks that came in the 1930s and 1940s or in that time. These artworks were like I say trying to bring back our culture and showing that matlab, a sense of the Indian culture is very strong in those. But that won't be the case, right?
Yes.
Because before the British were there, there was no single identity of a, matlab, there was no Indian identity as such. There were, let's say, smaller whatever kingdoms were there, and then the colonization
Hmm.
happens, and then the term of India comes in. So it was not like they were trying to bring back a old culture in, but rather creating a new culture of, let's say, bringing all the diversities. Like it looks like a reduction of all the identities that were existing previously, and probably those reduction as in now it is coming up uh, conflicts between these diversities and matlab, this reduction created the entire Indian identity, but then there are conflicts happening inside which are, let's say, not that much seen. I don't know how.
Okay. If I just want to, elaborate or think about that, I don't think there was a singular identity before the British came. So you're right about that. Okay. So every state or every princely kingdom was different by itself. Okay. But just before the British came, the Marathas ruled over almost all of India,
Yeah.
right? And before that, just before that, it was the Mughals, and the Mughals were sort of declining, and the Marathas were improving. So, so India was always in a flux in some sense. But as a land mass, it was always identifiable. That is why the British thought of it as India. Okay. Even 2000 years back, the whole land mass was always thought of as India. Nobody thought of Bengal separately and Mysore separately, or sort of the Punjab separately. So there is no unified homogeneous culture in India. We know that now also, and it was clear at that time also. So the Bengali intellectuals took inspiration from Bengal in some sense. So they were talking about Durga, they were talking about their cultures and their habits and their behaviors and their traditions. At the same time, things that were happening in Bombay were based in culture and history and traditions that were local to Bombay, right?
Yeah.
So I don't think it was that Abanindranath Tagore or Ravindranath Tagore were talking of a unified Indian culture as a singular monolithic thing in opposition to the British. But they were always talking of all of these things. Raja Ravi Verma went from Patiala to Baroda to Mysore and painted for kings. Right. So he was able to cater to a Punjabi king and a Mysore, the Raja of Mysore also at the same time. Because although they were different, there was a ethos which was similar, no, in some sense. Right. And that ethos translated to some identifiable things which were common, but there were large things which were different from each other also. And I think there was an awareness of that. But the larger thing is that they were also trying to oppose something which will come from outside. So, and what happens is when you're trying to oppose that, there has to be a unity of some kind, and it was that unity that they were using to oppose the imperialism. But the differences were always there. The difference is the fighting between different cultures within India also existed at the same time. Does that I mean, I don't know whether that is enough as a discussion, but I think
Yeah, so Nimish,
yeah, Priyansh?
adding to that, yeah, sorry, Shreyansh, do you want to comment on this first?
Mm, no.
No, so something that you were talking, that we already had these different small identities everywhere with respect to region, or even India was highly colonized before the British came also. Okay, so was it
Hmm.
that this smaller kind of identities coming together and trying to make a collective image of modern India was a kind of a problem, or I mean, I'm just putting it my thoughts out here for discussion. Or and even when you were talking about these, like every region had their own different identity. Like in Bombay there were a lot of things going on which was local to the region. Like a very
Hmm.
first example that comes into my mind with respect to architectural typology is the Parsi colonies, if suppose. So you have a
Yes.
very typical
Yes.
kind of, the colonies that exist almost beside near every station. It's what I have, uh,
Hmm.
kind of gathered. So that, of course, that was there. So I was just thinking that, was it something because we already had these diverse identities, and collectively we wanted to showcase something when it comes to the modernism, because we wanted to fight out for something collectively. So did that also kind of led to a lot of people coming in and telling us what exactly modernism means to us?
No, I don't think it was too much like that. I think it was a natural thing, right? That the British came with their idea of modernism. In fact, I mean, a surprising thing that we will find out later on, the British were not very modern in the architectural sense. The British government, the empire, so to say, when they built the current Rajpath, the current Indian parliamentary complex, um, they there was a debate. There was an Indian contingent which was sort of Nandlal Bose and Rabindranath Tagore and that whole intellectual circle, which wanted to use modern Western movement, modern Western style of architecture in the Indian Parliament. And in England, they wanted to leave their imprint of a colonial sort of power, and that is why they chose the that is why they chose what's his name, who's the architect, um,
Lutyens.
Lutyens,
Yeah.
because Lutyens, sorry, I mean, sometimes I forget names like that. But so that is why they chose Lutyens. At the same time, in England, in England also there was a move to tell the government that if in 1914, if they are going to build a new government building, a new sort of uh, governor's palace, and sort of the parliament, not the parliament building, but the Rajpath and the viceroy's palace and all of that. Uh, they should also do modern building, because there was a beginning already of modern movement in England. In India, there was an awareness of the modern movements in the West. But the British government, in opposition to both of these, went ahead and chose Lutyens, who decided to build in a distinctly Indo-Saracenic or a traditional style, which merged condescendingly Indian chhatris and stuff, Indian elements, to a Western, largely Western architecture, actually. Right? Because they were not modern at all. They were very imperial and sort of traditionalist in their point of view. So although we talk about, so the Western modernism is also very selective. They were always the Western modernists at that time, the Bauhaus, and sort of who we know, Mies, Gropius, the artist Picasso. They were outliers in the 1920s, actually. So although uh, there were certain influences coming in India, they were not considered by the ruling or the dominant parts of Western society as primary, the way they would be primary now. Even now in let's say in America or in England, Prince Charles thinks that all government buildings should be built in the Renaissance style or in the Gothic style, actually. So they think that that kind of architecture exudes this idea of government, idea of power and stuff like that. And modern buildings don't do that. So there was a conflict at that time also, and similarly, this is, I mean, so this thing is very sort of not very clear in that sense. There is a lot of different strands that you need to pull and think about, actually. So it's not, there's no answer to one thing, to this kind of conflict or mixing of styles or mixing of ideas and things like that.
Yeah, true. So anyone else? Akshay,
Anyone?
Dheer, Madhura.
No?
Or anyone from the class? Yeah.
Okay, I think then.
Uh,
Huh.
yeah, actually, this is something not like related to today's topic. I was reading the Raymond Williams that PDF. So,
Okay.
uh, the term that is
Hmm.
the modern, I just now is modern basically. That made me think a lot about it, that even today, uh, when we are hiring any interior designer or anything, I want a modern building, we say. So it actually made me think a lot in that terms, that actually we study about modernism as a this thing, but it's always now, I mean, I don't know how to explain it in words, but I mean that, yeah, it made me think a lot around that topic, that now is modernism basically. The now is modern. So yeah, we always refer to something that is trending right now, or while building something XYZ thing, we say that period is modern. So what is modernism? It actually makes question a lot, that what exactly is modernism? That is it that modern? Yeah, in that term. Yeah.
No, I think so. So the word, the correct word is actually contemporary. What is
Yeah.
modern is always contempt. So
Yeah.
what is right now, what is current, that is the meaning of the word modern in that, in one sense. But in the sense that we use modern, we use a particular sense of style actually. And I mean, imagine if suddenly everybody in India is building Spanish villas, then that will become modern or contemporary.
Yeah.
Right. So whatever is in fashion is modern actually, but in the technical sense of the word, but that is not what we ever mean. We mean something else. As architects, we mean modern is something completely different.
Yeah.
So yeah, yeah. Anything about the readings? Did you guys read the books or the articles, essays? I mean, I don't know. There are so many references to this. Any other references that you are thinking of or doing? Otherwise, we can finish. It's already 2:45. I'm hungry.
Yeah.
I have thesis after this, so
I think, guys, it will be great if you kind of read something and at least we comment on the readings, because that will only get hold on what, because there are huge references that Manish is telling us, and there are so many references to connect them. It is very important to get the base clear. So a very important question today, he was talking about the contemporary and the modern. So it's never the same. We are majorly talking about the modern movement, and it is very important to kind of decipher between the both. Okay, so I think that's a very important thing to let you think, because we always get confused between what is modern and what modern means to us, and what modern means meant during that time, and then what is contemporary then. So so I think we can leave you with these thoughts, but it would be great if you could read the readings. I mean, there was this one more reading you gave, Namish, no, last time. There was
I
this
know
Ramayana,
where is that 300 Ramayana.
300 Ramayana. Yeah. So actually, they are interesting readings which will actually kind of build your different concepts to analyze things and to look at things in a different way. And in turn, actually, this will also help in building up your arguments for your thesis. Okay, so so just for I mean, just build up on those concepts and readings, because it's very important to use these words like modern, contemporary, vernacular, tradition very, very carefully. So I think this is the time where we can analyze, discuss two conversations, and clarify our concepts a bit.
I have a
Is
comment
that
to make.
Sorry.
yeah?
Hi. Are these discussions relevant to this time? Because, like, when we talk about culture and what we have been, like, it's evident enough that
5 minutes.
uh,
5 minutes. My
as
classes are. Yeah.
it's evident enough that as architects or designers, in
Can you repeat? I'm sorry. I just got a call. I couldn't stop that.
I'm
Who is
sorry,
saying? Who's this?
I lost my connection. I'm sorry. This is Shantanu. So,
Shantanu.
my,
Okay.
yeah. So my question is that after the World War, we have seen that there's no particular direction in like after modernism and after the whole movement, there's no particular direction today in which buildings have been designed. So why have we still segregating things like this is culture, and it's about we have been moved to what
I can't hear you, Shantanu.
I mean, even I can't hear.
hello
No,
hello I'm
I
sorry.
think I understood a little bit from what he said
Like it's
that
like what we choose to be rather than what our past is. Like I think like it's more about what we as individuals choose to be.
yes. No, but I'm not sure. I think there is still always a dominant thing, no, in the world in terms of. I mean, if you look at architecture also, um, there are always dominant modes of practicing architecture in the world. And currently, if you see, there is a particular kind of mode which is dominant. Okay. Now, a very simple way of judging it is the way the Pritzker prizes are announced in architecture. Okay. If you see the last few years, the Pritzker prizes have gone to people who have not done. I mean, if you start with the first prize winner, Philip Johnson, okay, there was architecture with capital A or architecture as a commercial corporate enterprise. After that, yes, so some for a few years, some of the great earlier architects were fitted, and got the Pritzkers. But there was a long period of time where it was always these, star architects who became the Pritzker Awards. From Frank Gehry to Zaha Hadid to all these star architects. So from that was a boom or sort of the like the 70s and the 80s in the corporate in the Western world. Same way from the late 90s to the early 2010s, it was this uh, push to star architecture, actually this kind of fancy expensive signature architecture, and those were the people who were getting the Pritzker awards. But if you see in the last 5 6 years, there has been a change. There are architects who are working for social causes. There are the latest winners of people who are actually more proficient in repairing older buildings. They have won the Pritzker award. you know so then Alejandro Aravena won the Pritzker award for his unfinished buildings, in the favelas in Brazil. So in some sense, there is a move now. The world is suddenly like sustainability, social purpose, social responsibility. How genuine we don't know, but that has started becoming more crucial in, sort of, at least in the public sphere. So there is a change always. There is a pulse that is always there, which is dominant. Within that, there are hundreds of variations. Is that do you understand what I'm trying to say? I'm not saying what you are saying that it's wrong, but there is something like that which is slightly always dominant. So after modernism, there was postmodernism, which was dominant for a particular period of time. Then there was deconstructivism, and throughout all of that, there was this large corporate developer architecture, which was always prominent, but which was always working in the background because they were building 90% of the buildings, which were buildings which are not published in magazines, which are buildings which are not seen, largely, by within the architecture circles or the in the academic circles. But that is the body of work. That is a large body of work that is being built. And the same thing is happening even now. So what we consider as dominant is a minuscule percentage of the actual architecture being built in the world.
All right.
Yeah.
Right.
Also, sorry, one just last thing I would like to add is that this whole idea of dominant
Gender.
that you were talking, Nemish, and what
Hmm.
Shantanu was saying, that why are we discussing this, because it's already a past and we choose what we want to be. So this whole idea of dominant is always a factor which is associated on what we choose, and it is always related to somewhere, what we choose, and this whole idea of dominance is related to what we had experienced in past or seen in the past or whatever. So either we choose to resonate with or totally get devoid of it. So I think that's driving force which also helps us to choose what we want to be, and I think that's why it's very important to kind of discuss that.
Yeah. No, that is true. Correct.
Yeah, I got your point.
Okay.
Okay.
So we meet next time.
Yeah. Yeah. I think
Yeah.